From the StarTac to the Razr to the Droid, Motorola consistently produced some of the best phones out there. Phones people actually wanted to buy. But during the summer of 2010, Motorola took a little detour from their normal safe designs with two new and very unique phones, the Flipout and Charm. I don't have a Flipout unfortunately, but I do have a Charm, and man is this thing weird. Although it doesn't immediately look like a very unique device, the Charm is a pretty unusual size. It's short but wide, meaning when held in the hand it feels much more squarish than most other rectangular phones. It's even more obvious when you put it next to the Motorola Droid Pro, which is pretty much the Charm's more expensive cousin. And yes, the Charm was a budget-friendly device, so keep that in mind for the rest of this video. The Charm was one of the few devices to have Motorola's Moto Blur skin running on top of Android 2.1 Eclair. Moto Blur was just another one of the many Android skins manufacturers would cook up to try and make their devices look more appealing by adding often unnecessary features that weren't originally built into Android. Moto Blur was unfortunately one of the more messy, overwhelming skins that just cluttered the whole phone with stuff you didn't really need. It relied on servers that no longer exist, so while I can't demonstrate much of it here, there are plenty of images online showing the social media widgets that cluttered the Moto Blur home screen. The upside of those servers being down is the Charm is pretty clean. Unlike the messy widget-covered home screens you normally get with a Moto Blur phone, none of it loads up anymore, and now it's just basically stock Android with a slightly customized home screen, and some optional and non-functional Moto Blur widgets. Without all that extra stuff bogging this thing down, it's actually super responsive and smooth. The Charm had some decent specs for the time with a Texas Instruments OMAP 3410 processor and 512 megabytes of RAM. It may not have been the best, but it definitely wasn't bad. Opening apps, scrolling through menus, and web browsing are all still fully functional, and surprisingly, even today, the Charm performs better than I expected. I can't say the same for this display though. The Charm's tiny 2.8-inch touchscreen was highly criticized for its low resolution and poor viewing angles. Over time, of course, this has only gotten more noticeable. Web browsing was supposed to be something you'd enjoy doing with the Charm, but the low resolution makes a mess out of anything but the largest text fonts. It's not usually illegible, but it's still not great to look at. That wasn't very uncommon for mobile web browsing at the time though, so while this would be unacceptable on any modern device, it wasn't necessarily enough to make a prospective Charm buyer at the time look elsewhere. Besides the low quality, there's a bigger issue here. If you haven't already noticed, the Charm's display, unlike almost every other Android phone in existence, is horizontal. The problem with that being, Android is designed to run, at least most of the time, vertically. From the first Android phone to the Android phones of today, there's a good reason the screens are tall instead of wide. To be fair, in 2010 you could kind of get away with this since web pages are still mostly formatted for desktop computers, and the Charm usually makes sure any app that can operate horizontally will do so. But the standard for many smartphone apps was still there. For any of the apps that only run vertically, you have to awkwardly hold the phone sideways, which gets even more awkward when you have to use the keyboard. This means you're either using the keyboard sideways or viewing the display sideways as you type. Not ideal for sure. The Charm's width is not just a result of its oddly horizontal display. This wide design also allows plenty of room for a full physical QWERTY style keyboard, and it's actually a bit bigger than similar devices like the Motorola Droid Pro. While this keyboard was one of the most highly praised aspects of the phone, I'm not really a fan of the rounded rubbery feeling keys. I personally prefer the flat clicky plastic feeling keys on the Droid Pro, but I digress. The Charm's quirky design wasn't limited to its odd form factor. Unlike the boring plain black or silver phones of the time, the Charm has subtle color accents around the front border, on the keys, earpiece, and rear speaker. The Charm was available in two different color options, gold and bronze, which is kind of ugly in my opinion, and then Cabernet, which is the one I have here. The keys also light up in neon blue, which kind of adds to the fun aesthetic, but the backlighting is so dim you can really only see it in complete darkness. Any amount of ambient light and you wouldn't even know this keyboard had any backlighting at all. Flipping the phone around and taking a look at the back, the Charm's got two rectangles. The smaller one being the 3 megapixel camera, and the larger one, well, this is more interesting. This thing is more or less a trackpad like what you'd get on a laptop. Motorola called it Backtrack and only made two devices that have it, the Charm and the Backflip. Oddly, Backtrack is disabled by default, but jumping into settings it's pretty easy to enable just by checking one little box. Normally, Backtrack works similarly to other swipeable or rollable inputs, with more of a focus on scrolling web pages and lists than selecting items on screen. Double tap the Backtrack pad, however, and you'll enable a Backtrack cursor. This crosshair style cursor is moved around the screen by moving your finger across the Backtrack pad and works pretty much just like the trackpad on a laptop. As fun as this is to play around with, I can definitely see why it wasn't much of a success. The cursor jumps around a lot, and while this was probably meant to be an easier input method compared to the tiny touchscreen, the touchscreen is still far more intuitive. For anyone wondering, yes, Backtrack does work in some games, but just barely. Oddly enough, Backtrack seems to function in more apps than the arrow buttons on the physical keyboard. Not that you'd want to use this keyboard for gaming, but it would be nice to have that option. Speaking of gaming, you could probably already guess that this isn't exactly a gaming phone. It's a little slow and stuttery in pretty much every game I tried, and when a game is designed to run exclusively in portrait orientation, which is pretty common, you have to awkwardly hold the phone sideways and play around the keyboard. On the other hand, for 2010, I think you could easily spend plenty of time playing games on this thing with no problems. Were there better phones for gaming? Of course there were. Would that have stopped me from wasting hours playing games on this phone in 2010? Absolutely not. I would have loved this phone and not given a second thought to the comparatively slow and awkward gaming performance. Even now, I actually ended up spending quite a bit of time playing some old games I had almost forgotten about on the Charm, and it was still completely enjoyable. Not so fun is this little 3 megapixel camera. Sure, this was 2010 and cell phone camera standards were very different than today, but even for the time, this camera was pretty lackluster with muted colors and plenty of noise. Video recording is unsurprisingly even worse, recording videos at a laughably low resolution, and of course, there's no stabilization, autofocus, or any of that stuff here. It is a functional video recorder though, and it's pretty nostalgic for those of us who made good use of these camera phones back in the early 2010s. Even though the Charm definitely has some weird quirks like the horizontal display, this is not really the Charm's fault. All apps built into the phone from the factory work just fine in this horizontal display, and you know what? I think that may be the whole purpose of this phone. Even though it is running Android, this phone wasn't really meant to do much more than what it could do right out of the box. This is further proven by its incredibly small amount of internal storage that is pretty much already filled up with all the apps that were included with the phone. For the type of person who is purchasing an inexpensive phone with a tiny touchscreen and physical keyboard, these limitations were probably not a huge deal. It made a decent messaging and casual social media phone, which is exactly what it was designed for. That being said, the Charm landed in a market where smartphones were starting to get exciting and not so smartphones were starting to become very budget friendly. Remember, even though the device itself wasn't all that pricey, it required a data plan from T-Mobile, which could end up costing the buyer more than they really needed. So adults looking for a good smartphone were more likely to pick up a bigger, more capable device, like the iPhone 4 or HTC Droid Incredible, while teens looking for cheap texting phones were still going with devices like the LG Envy, Rumor, or Samsung Intensity. That left devices like the Charm in an awkward in-between spot where they neither boasted top-end specs or were affordable enough to be a viable option for teens and those who didn't want a fully fledged smartphone. The Charm with its tiny display and mediocre keyboard was probably not even considered a smartphone by most people at the time, and with the limitations, it's easy to see why. Being a T-Mobile exclusive was also kind of a point against the Charm since, at that time, T-Mobile didn't have the best reputation for reliability. The Charm also didn't get great news coverage, with very few tech reviewers giving it much attention at all. Now, the few reviewers who did talk about this thing had mostly positive things to say about it, but it just didn't create enough hype because, well, just look at this thing. There's nothing to really get excited about. I'm only reviewing it on here because I think it's weird and deserves some attention for its funky aesthetic. So while I can absolutely see why it wasn't successful, it's an awesome little gadget to play around with 5 years later. Overall, I think you can pretty much get a good idea of what this thing is just from its name. This is without doubt one of the most charming phones I've ever used, even if it had no good reason to exist. I think that's going to wrap up this quick look at the Motorola Charm. As I said at the beginning of this video, I really wanted to also take a look at the Motorola Flipout, but I don't have one at this time. If you would like to see another video on some Moto Blur era devices, please let me know in the comments below, and while you're down there, it would be awesome if you could hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.